This salient is untenable. We must withdraw immediately.
Absolutely not. We hold our ground or everything is lost.
You want to know when I realized the war was already lost? Not when the bombs stopped. Not when Berlin fell. Not even when the orders started sounding desperate. It was much earlier than that. And what makes it worse is that the men giving those orders knew it too. They knew exactly what was coming. They saw the same maps we saw. They read the same reports. They heard the same silence on the radio where entire divisions used to be. And still, they kept sending us forward. I remember the first time it didn't make sense anymore. We were standing in the cold, boots sinking into mud that had swallowed better men than me, waiting for instructions that took too long to arrive. When they finally came, nobody spoke at first. Not because we didn't understand, but because we understood too well. We were being sent somewhere that no longer mattered, to hold ground that was already gone. You might think soldiers don't question orders, that we just move, shoot, survive. But that's not how it works when you've been in it long enough, when you've seen entire units disappear overnight, when you've carried men who stopped breathing before you could even learn their names. You start to feel it. That quiet shift, that invisible line where war stops being about victory and becomes something else entirely. By then, rumors had already started spreading through the ranks. Not loud, not open, just whispers between men who trusted each other enough to say what couldn't be said out loud. They said the high command already knew. They said the maps in headquarters looked nothing like the ones they showed us. They said entire fronts were collapsing, and we were still being told to advance. And here's the part no one tells you. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't confusion. It was controlled. Deliberate, like someone had already accepted the outcome but refused to say it. Like the war was still being played out, not to win, but because stopping it would mean admitting something far worse. You're probably wondering why we didn't just stop, why we didn't refuse. I used to ask myself the same thing, and the answer is not simple. Because when you're there, when everything you know is behind you and everything in front of you is death, obedience becomes something else. It becomes survival, or at least the illusion of it. There was a moment. I can still see it clearly, when one of the officers looked at us before giving the order, and for a second, just a second, he hesitated, not because he doubted the mission, but because he knew exactly what it meant. He wasn't sending soldiers into battle. He was sending men to disappear. And we all saw it. That hesitation, that silence, that truth no one dared to say. From that moment on, everything changed. Not outside. The war kept going. The guns kept firing. The orders kept coming. But inside, something broke. Something that never came back. Because once you realize you're not fighting to win anymore, once you understand that the people above you already know the ending, and still choose to keep it going, you stop believing in anything they tell you, and that's when the real war begins. You learn to recognize it after a while, not the sound of artillery, not the whistle of incoming shells, but the silence between orders, that strange pause that stretches longer than it should, like someone, somewhere, is buying time they no longer have. And the longer that silence grows, the more you begin to understand that something is wrong far beyond your reach. We moved at dawn that day. If you can call it dawn. The sky never really cleared anymore. Just different shades of gray pressing down on us. Smoke, ash, clouds, it all blended together until you couldn't tell where the world ended and the war began. And still, we marched. Because that's what we were told to do. No one talked much anymore. Not because we had nothing to say, but because saying it out loud would make it real. You ever notice how men start looking at each other differently when hope is gone? Not with fear, not even with sadness, but with something heavier. Something like understanding. like each of us already knew how this would end, just not when. Or where. We were told the objective was critical. They always said that every patch of mud, every broken village, every line on a map was suddenly essential. But by then, we had seen too many essential positions fall within hours, sometimes minutes. And the pattern was always the same. We arrive, we hold, we get surrounded, and then the radio goes quiet. And yet, the orders never changed. Keep moving, all the line. Advance at all costs. Those words start to sound different when you've heard them enough times. They stop being commands and start feeling like something else. Like a script, like everyone above you is following a plan that no longer fits reality. But no one has the courage to stop reading from it. There was a map. I remember that map like it was burned into my eyes. We weren't supposed to see it. It was inside a transport vehicle, left open for just a moment too long. One of the men noticed it first, called me over without saying a word, just pointed the front lines. They weren't where we thought they were. They were broken, scattered, collapsing inward like a structure that had already lost its foundation. Entire sections marked as active were nothing but empty space. Units that no longer existed still represented as if they were holding position. And behind it all, arrows pointing forward, always forward. That's when it hit me. Not like a sudden realization, more like something that had been forming quietly inside me, finally taking shape. We weren't part of a strategy anymore. We were part of a delay, a prolonging, a way to stretch something that had already ended. You don't forget the feeling that comes with that. It's not panic. It's not even fear. It's clarity. Cold, heavy clarity. We closed the vehicle and said nothing, because what could we say? That the war was already over. That the lines we were told to defend didn't exist anymore. That the men making the decisions knew exactly what was happening and chose to continue anyway. No one wants to be the one to say that out loud. So we kept walking. The village we were sent to. I don't remember its name. Most of them didn't have names anymore. Just ruins, smoke, and whatever was left of the people who used to live there. We arrived just before nightfall, and something felt wrong immediately. Toca callet. Toca, no resistance. No movement. Just the sound of wind moving through broken walls. You'd think that would be a relief, but it wasn't. Because by then, we knew what silence like that usually meant. It meant we were already too late, or too early, and neither option was good. We took positions anyway. That's what we did. We always took positions. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Some of the men started to relax. Not fully, never fully, but enough to sit down, to lean against something, to close their eyes for just a moment. And that's when it started. Not with an explosion. Not with shouting. Just a single shot, somewhere far enough to be uncertain, close enough to matter. And then another, and another, until the silence was gone, replaced by that familiar chaos. Bullets cutting through the air, walls collapsing, voices shouting orders that no longer meant anything. And in the middle of it all, I remember thinking something I had never allowed myself to think before. This isn't a battle. This is an ending. We held as long as we could. Maybe hours, maybe less. Time doesn't work the same way in moments like that. It stretches, bends, disappears. All I know is that one by one, the positions fell. Just like before, just like always. And still, the radio kept repeating the same words. All the line. Reinforcements are coming. All the line. We all knew that wasn't true. Not because we had proof, but because we had experience. And experience is a cruel teacher. It doesn't lie to you, it shows you patterns. And once you've seen enough of them, you stop believing in anything that doesn't match. At some point, the officer in charge tried to regroup what was left of us. His voice was steady, controlled, almost calm. But his eyes told a different story. He wasn't leading anymore. He was managing the inevitable. That's when someone asked the question, not lewdly, not defiantly, just enough to be heard. Why are we still here? No one answered, because everyone already knew. And in that silence, louder than any explosion, heavier than any order, the truth settled over all of us like something final. We weren't fighting for victory. We weren't even fighting for survival. We were just continuing. And sometimes, continuing is worse than ending, because it means someone, somewhere, made the decision that stopping was no longer an option. Even when it should have been. Even when it had to be. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the gunfire, not the cold, not the fear, but that decision, that moment when the people in control chose to keep it going, knowing exactly what it would cost. Not in numbers, not in reports, but in faces, in names, in men who never came back. And the worst part, we kept following those orders, not because we believed in them anymore, but because we didn't know how to do anything else. And once that happens, once obedience replaces reason, you're no longer part of a war. You're part of something much darker. And it doesn't end when the fighting stops. It stays with you. Long after everything else is gone, there's a point in every war. They don't tell you about it in training, and no one writes it down in reports. A point where the enemy in front of you stops being the thing you fear the most, and something else takes its place. Something quieter, something closer. It starts small. A hesitation before moving. A longer look at the map. A question that never leaves your mouth. And then, one day, you realize it's no longer about surviving the enemy. It's about surviving the decisions being made above you. That realization doesn't come all at once. It builds layer by layer. Like cracks in glass that spread so slowly you almost don't notice them, until one day, the whole thing shatters. For us, it happened after that village. What was left of our unit was pulled back, not to rest, not to reorganize, but to be reassigned. New orders, new direction, same outcome. You could feel it before anyone even spoke. We were fewer now. Not just in numbers, in presence, in voice, in everything that made a group of men feel like something solid. And still, the structure around us remained intact. Officers, ranks, commands, all of it still functioning, as if the reality we were living hadn't reached them yet. Or worse, as if it had. And they chose to continue anyway. We were loaded into transport trucks that barely ran. Engines coughing, metal rattling like it was ready to fall apart at any moment. And as we moved, I remember looking at the faces around me. No one asked where we were going. No one needed to. It didn't matter anymore. Destination had lost its meaning. All that mattered was the pattern. Move, hold, collapse, repeat. You ever see a man stop reacting to danger? Not because he's brave, not because he's trained, but because something inside him has simply shut down. We had a few like that now. Men who no longer flinched when shots were fired. Men who followed orders without even looking. Men who had already left, even though their bodies were still there. That's when I understood something. I wish I hadn't. The war wasn't just killing men. It was emptying them, piece by piece. until there was nothing left to save. We arrived near what used to be a defensive line, or at least that's what the map said. But maps had stopped meaning much by then. Reality had its own version of the truth, and it rarely matched what we were told. There were trenches, abandoned, half filled with water, mud, and things no one wanted to look at too closely. Equipment left behind. Weapons scattered, signs of a fight that had already come and gone. We weren't reinforcing a position. We were stepping into the aftermath of something that had already failed. And still, the order was the same. Hold. Hold. Rebuild. Prepare for counterattack. The officer reading the order didn't even try to make it sound convincing. He just read it. Flat, like a man reciting something he no longer believed in. And for the first time, no one pretended. No nods. No movement. Just silence. Long, heavy silence. And then, slowly, we started moving anyway. Because what else was there to do? That's the trap no one talks about. Not fear. Not fear. Not discipline. Routine. Once you've done something enough times, even if it no longer makes sense, even if it leads to the same result every time, you keep doing it, because stopping would require something none of us had anymore. Energy. Hope. Believe. We spent the next hours trying to rebuild something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Digging into soil that wouldn't hold, setting up positions that offered no cover, organizing lines that had already been broken before we arrived. It felt like trying to fix a wall that had already collapsed, knowing full well it would fall again, but still stacking the pieces because someone told you to. At some point, I found myself next to a man I barely knew. Younger than me, couldn't have been more than 20, hands shaking as he tried to secure his rifle. Not from cold, but from something deeper. He looked at me, not asking for help, not asking for reassurance, just looking. And then he said something I still hear sometimes. Do you think they know? Simple question, but it carried everything. I didn't answer right away, because I knew what he meant. Not, do they know we're here? Not, do they know the enemy is coming? But, do they know this is pointless? Do they know we're not coming back? Do they know they're sending us here to disappear? I looked at him, and for a second, I considered lying. Saying something that would make it easier. Something that would give him a reason to keep going without thinking too much. But I couldn't. Because by then, lies felt heavier than the truth. So I just nodded. And that was enough. He didn't react. Didn't panic. Didn't say anything else. Just accepted Italiano and went back to what he was doing. That's when it became real to me. Not the war, not the danger, the acceptance. The moment when a man understands exactly what's happening and continues anyway. There's something deeply unsettling about that. Something that stays with you. Because it means the system worked. Not in the way it was supposed to, but in the way it was designed to. It kept us moving, even when stopping would have been the only logical choice. Night came again, and with it, that same oppressive darkness, broken only by distant flashes, and the occasional sound of something collapsing somewhere far away. We took positions, waited, listened. No one spoke. We didn't need to anymore. Everything that could be said had already been understood. And somewhere in that silence, I realized something else. The enemy wasn't the only force pushing us forward. There was something behind us too. Not physically, not visibly, but present. Pressure. expectation. Expectation. The weight of everything that had come before. The idea that turning back wasn't just impossible, it was unthinkable. So, we stayed. We waited. We followed orders that no longer had purpose. And in doing so, we became part of something none of us had signed up for. Not a battle. Not a mission. Not even a war. But a continuation. A slow, deliberate continuation of something that should have ended long before we arrived. And once you're inside that, once you realize that the people making the decisions already know how it ends, and still choose to keep it going, you stop asking why, because there is no answer that makes sense. Only the next order, and the one after that, and the one after that, until there's nothing left to follow. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything collapsed in front of us. No dramatic signal, no final order, no voice on the radio telling us it was over. It was slower than that. Much slower. And somehow, that made it worse. Because when something ends suddenly, you can react. You can process it. You can at least understand that a line has been crossed. But when it fades, when it weakens piece by piece, when the structure around you starts disappearing without anyone acknowledging it, you're left standing in something that no longer exists, pretending it still does. That's where we were. Still wearing uniforms. Still carrying weapons. Still receiving orders. But the system behind it, the thing that made all of it mean something, was already gone. You could see it in small things first. Supply trucks that never arrived. Messages that took too long. Commands that contradicted each other. Officers repeating instructions like they were trying to convince themselves. It didn't feel like leadership anymore. It felt like imitation. Like everyone was playing a role in something that had already ended, but no one had been told to stop. The radio became the clearest sign. It used to be constant. Voices, coordinates, updates, requests. A steady flow that connected everything, gave it structure, purpose. Now, it was different. Long gaps, static, fragments of messages that cut off mid, calls that went unanswered, entire units trying to reach anyone and getting nothing back. At first, we told ourselves it was interference. Then we said it was damage. Then we stopped explaining it, because deep down, we already knew there was no one left to answer. I remember one night, sitting in a position that barely held together, listening to that empty radio, and for a moment, I imagined what it would sound like if someone finally said it. It's over. Just those two words. Simple, final, honest. But they never came. Instead, we kept getting the same instructions. Hold. Wait. Prepare. Words that used to carry weight, now reduced to echoes. Repeated out of habit, not belief. That's when the first real cracks started showing in the men around me. Not panic. Not rebellion. Something quieter. Detachment. You'd see it in their eyes. That distant look, like they were no longer fully there. Like part of them had already stepped away from everything around us. Some stopped cleaning their weapons. Some stopped checking their gear. Some stopped reacting altogether, not because they didn't care, but because caring required energy they no longer had. And when enough men reach that point, something changes. Not in the orders, not in the structure, but in the outcome. Because a unit held together by routine can still function, but a unit held together by nothing falls apart without making a sound. We were close to that, closer than anyone wanted to admit. Then came the day that made it undeniable. We received orders to move again, another position. another position, another line, another place we were told was critical. But this time, something was different. No breathing, no explanation, just coordinates. And a deadline. That alone would have been strange. But what came next was worse. No support, no artillery preparation, no communication with adjacent units, nothing. Nothing. It wasn't an operation. It was a movement into emptiness. Even the officer reading the order seemed off. Not hesitant, not emotional, just detached, like he was reading something that didn't concern him anymore. And for the first time, no one moved immediately. We stood there, waiting, not for new instructions, but for something to make sense. And nothing did. That's when one of the older soldiers spoke, a man who had been there longer than most of us. Someone who had seen enough to understand what others were still trying to ignore. He didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge the order directly. Just said, "There's nothing there." Not a guess, not a question, a statement. The officer looked at him, held his gaze for a second too long, and then looked away. That was the answer. Not in words, but in silence. We moved anyway. Of course we did. Because even when everything inside you is telling you this makes no sense, that it leads nowhere, that it changes nothing, you still move. Because not moving feels like breaking something you're not allowed to break. The terrain we crossed that day, it didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked abandoned, like something had passed through and taken everything with it, not destroyed. Just emptied. No signs of recent fighting. No positions. No defenses. Nothing. Nothing, just space. And the further we went, the clearer it became. There was no line to hold, no objective to secure, no enemy to engage. We weren't being sent into a battle. We were being sent into nothing. And that's when it hit all of us at the same time. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't delay. This wasn't even war anymore. This was abandonment. Not the kind where someone leaves you behind by accident. The kind where they know exactly where you are and choose not to come back. You could feel it in the way the men stopped scanning the horizon, stopped checking their stopped preparing. Because what do you prepare for when there's nothing ahead and nothing behind? We reached the coordinates, or at least what used to be something that mattered enough to have coordinates. And we stood there. No orders followed. No updates. No contact. Hoofs on silence. Real silence. Not the kind filled with distant gunfire or movement. The kind that feels final, and in that moment, no one needed to say it. We had been sent there, not to fight, not to hold, not to win, but to disappear. That's the word that stayed with me. Disappear. Because it explained everything. The empty maps, the broken communication, the repeated orders with no meaning, the absence of support. Silence. We weren't part of the war anymore. We were what was left of it. And once you realize that, once you understand that the system you trusted is no longer trying to sustain you, you face something far worse than the enemy. You face the truth. And the truth is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It, Keith, Kust settles in heavy, unavoidable. Final, we stayed there for hours. Maybe longer. Time didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. Some men sat down, others stood. A few just stared into nothing, waiting not for orders, but for something to confirm what we already knew. And nothing came, because there was nothing left to come. And in that silence, in that absence of everything, the war, as we had known it, ended up not with victory, not with defeat, but with abandonment. The first one didn't scream. That's what I remember most. No outburst, no anger, no dramatic moment like you'd expect when a man finally breaks. It was quieter than that. Almost invisible. The kind of thing you only notice if you're paying attention. And by then, most of us weren't. He just stopped. Stopped adjusting his gear. Stopped looking around. Stopped reacting. At first, I thought he was just exhausted. We all were. That kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body, that settles somewhere deeper, where even thinking feels like work. But then I saw his hands. Still not shaking, not tense, just still. And his eyes, not focused on anything, not scanning, not watching, just open, like he was looking through everything instead of at it. I called his name once. No response. Not because he didn't hear me, but because he had already stepped away from whatever this was. There's a difference between fear and absence. Fear keeps you alert. Absence takes you out of it completely. And that's where he was. Gone. While still standing right there next to us, no one said anything, because we all understood, even if we didn't want to admit it, that what happened to him wasn't sudden. It was the result of everything we had been ignoring, everything we had been pushing down, everything we had accepted without question. Who's reached the end of it first? We left him there, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but because no one knew what to do. There were no orders for that. No protocol, no structure left to handle something like that. So we did what we had been trained to do all along. We kept moving. But something shifted after that. Not in the environment, not in the orders, in us. Because once you see a man disappear like that, without a wound, without a shot fired, just gone from the inside, you start to wonder how close you are to the same edge. And that question doesn't leave you. It stays. Quiet, persistent, growing. That's when the conversations started. Not loud. Not loud. Not organized. Just unfragment. Exchange between men who still had enough left to speak. What if we don't move? What if we stay here? What if we just stop? Simple questions, but dangerous ones, because asking them means you've already stepped outside the structure, even if just for a moment. And once you do that, it becomes harder to go back. There was a group, small, maybe 5 or 6. They didn't make a scene, didn't argue, didn't try to convince anyone else. They just stippeth Hawaii, not running, not heaving, just walking in the opposite direction. Slow, deliberate. Like men who had finally made a decision, not out of panic, but out of clarity. No one stopped them. No one called them back. Because deep down, every single one of us understood what they were doing. They weren't deserting. They were choosing to end something that no longer had a reason to continue. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought about following them. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was afraid of staying, afraid of continuing, afraid of becoming like the man who had already disappeared without moving. But I didn't go. None of us did, and that's something I've thought about more times than I can count. Why we stayed, why we kept following orders that had lost all meaning, why we chose the known outcome over uncertain escape. The answer isn't simple. It never is. Part of it is habit. Part of it is fear. Part of it is the weight of everything that came before. But there's something else, too. Something harder to admit. Responsibility. Not to the command. Not to the mission. To each other. Because leaving doesn't just mean saving yourself. It means leaving the others behind. And when you've been through enough together, when you've seen what we had seen, done what we had done, that becomes a line that's hard to cross. Even when you know staying changes nothing. Even when you know how it ends. So, we stayed. Not because we believed anymore, but because we couldn't bring ourselves to walk away from the men standing next to us. And maybe that was the last real thing left in all of it. Not the word, not the orders, not the structure. Guest and that. Men estaling. 4 other men, even when everything else was already gone. Night came again, but it didn't feel like the nights before. There was no tension, no anticipation. No sense of waiting for something to happen. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something else began to surface. Anger. Not loud. Not loud. Not explosive. But present. Directed. Not at the enemy. At the ones who had put us there. The ones who knew. The ones who had seen the same reality we were now living, and chose to ignore it. To continue, to send more men into something that had already ended. You don't shout that kind of anger. You carry Italiano, quietly, until it becomes part of you. Until it shapes the way you see everything, including yourself. Because once you start questioning them, you start questioning everything that led you there. Every order you followed. Every step you took. Every moment you chose not to stop. And that's a place most men don't want to go, because there's no easy way back from it. At some point during that night, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning. There was no rescue coming, no reinforcement. No final push, no turning point. Just on continuation, until there was nothing left to continue. And in that realization, something inside me settled. Not ope, not acceptance. Something else? A kind of quiet readiness. Not for victory, not even for survival, but for whatever came next, without illusion, without expectation. Just facing Italiano as it was. And that changes you. Because once you strip away everything that isn't real, once you see the situation without the layers of orders, promises, and explanations, what remains? His truth. And truth doesn't comfort you. It doesn't guide you. It just exists. And you either face it, or you disappear, trying not to. Morning came without warning. No gradual light. No sense of a new beginning. Just a different shade of gray settling over everything that was already broken. We didn't wake up. Most of us hadn't really slept. We just stood up, one by one, as if something inside us still responded to time, even when nothing else did. There were fewer of us now. No one asked where the others had gone. No one needed to, because by then, absence had become part of the landscape. Like the ruins, like the silence, like everything else that used to mean something. I remember looking around, trying to find something familiar, something that still connected to the world before all of this. But there was nothing left that felt real in that way. Just men, standing in a place that no longer had a purpose, waiting for something that wasn't coming. And then, the radio made a sound. Not ecstatic. Not ecstatic. Not interference. A voice. Clear. Clear. For the first time in what felt like forever, we all turned at the same time. Not out of hope, but out of instinct. Because even after everything, some part of us still responded to command. The message was short. To sword. No introduction. No explanation. No attempt to frame it in anything that resembled strategy. Just a statement. All units, cease. Operations. That was Italiano. No elaboration. No follow-up. No reassurance. Just those words. And for a moment, no one move, because after everything we had been through, after all the orders that had pushed us forward, after all the silence, the contradictions, the abandonment, it felt unreal, not like an ending, more like a pause, like something was missing, like there should have been more, but there wasn't. We stood there, listening, waiting for the rest, for the part that would tell us what to do next, where to go, how to proceed. Nothing came. The radio went silent again, and that was when it settled in, slowly, heavily. Final, it wasn't a pause, it wasn't a transition. It was over, not with a victory. Not with a clear defeat. Not with any of the things we had imagined when all of this began. Just over. And the strangest part, no one reacted the way you'd expect. No cheering. No relief. No collapse. Just stillness. Because when something drags on long enough, when it takes everything from you piece by piece, when it strips away meaning, belief, direction, there's nothing left to respond with. You don't feel the end. Just notice that there's nothing more to continue. One of the men sat down, slowly, like he had just remembered how. Another removed his helmet, stared at it for a few seconds, then placed it on the ground, carefully, as if it still mattered. As if anything still needed to be preserved. I looked at my hands, still dirty, still steady, still holding on to something that no longer had a purpose. And for the first time, he let go. Not dramatically, not symbolically, just loosened my grip. And that was it. That was the moment. Not when the war ended, but when it stopped existing inside me, because that's the part no one prepares you for. The after, not the return, not the rebuilding, just the space that's left when something that consumed your entire reality suddenly isn't there anymore, and you don't know what to do with yourself without it. We didn't leave right away. There were no instructions for that. No direction, no plan. So we stayed. For a while, standing in the same place where we had been sent to disappear, now with no reason to be there at all. Some of the men started walking eventually. Not together, not in formation. Just moving individually, like each one of us had to figure out on our own what direction meant again. I stayed a little longer. I don't know why. Maybe because leaving would make it real. Maybe because I needed to see it, to understand it, to accept that everything we had been through, everything we had followed, everything we had believed in, ended like this, quietly, without explanation, without closure. Just, gone. And as I finally started walking away from that place, away from everything that had defined us for so long, I realized something that never really leaves you. The war doesn't end when the orders stop. It doesn't end when the guns go silent. It doesn't end when someone tells you it's over. It ends when you understand what it really was, and that understanding comes later, sometimes much later. Because at the time, you're too close to it, too deep inside it, too used to it, to see it clearly. You only see it afterward, in fragments. In fragments, in memories that don't line up the way they should, in questions that don't have answers, like why it continued, long after it should have stopped, why men were sent forward when there was nothing left to gain, why silence replaced truth, and why even when we knew, we kept going. I've asked myself that more times than I can count, and every time the answer changes a little. Sometimes it's obedience, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's loyalty, sometimes it's something harder to define, but none of those answers feel complete. Because the truth is, it wasn't just one thing, it was all of it. Layered, entangled, impossible to separate. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not the battles, not the strategies, not the outcomes, but the choices, the ones made at the top, the ones followed below, the ones questioned, and the ones never spoken. Because those are the things that carry forward, long after everything else fades, long after the maps are redrawn, long after the stories are simplified. Those choices remain, in the men who survived, in the silence they carry, in the way they look at things differently from everyone else. I still remember that moment in the village, the hesitation in the officer's eyes, that brief pause before giving an order he knew would send men to disappear. At the time, it felt small, almost insignificant. But now, Primera un Herstand, that was the war, not the explosions, not the movement, not the noise. That hesitation, that knowing, that choice, and everything that followed it. You can study the war. You can read about it. You can analyze it from every angle. But unless you've stood in that moment, unless you've felt that weight, you'll never fully understand what it meant. Because from the outside, it looks like strategy. From the inside, it feels like something else entirely. Something quieter, something heavier, something that stays with you long after everything else is gone. And if there's one thing I know now, one thing I wish more people understood, this. The war wasn't just lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the moments when the people who knew the truth chose to continue anyway.